my pleasure to introduce Maureen McLane. Professor McLane was educated at Harvard, Oxford, and the University of Chicago, where she received her PhD in 1997. She is the author of 2 books of poems, World Enough, published in 2010, and Same Life, published in 2008, and a poetry chapbook, This Caring Life, published in 2005. Always aware of the idea of place and the mental, physical, and emotional spaces we inhabit, her poetry asks us to consider how we negotiate and position ourselves within these worlds. The idea of place and the different spaces we live and breathe and move in is also perhaps a good way of understanding Professor McLane's professional career. As both a poet and a critic, she brings the perspective of a scholar who has inhabited different kinds of intellectual spaces, and her work offers insights from both. As a student of Romanticism, my first exposure to Professor McLane's work was her monograph, Balladeering, Minstrelsy, and the Making of British Romantic Poetry, published in 2008. Among her long list of other critical accomplishments includes authoring Romanticism and the Human Sciences in 2006 and co-editing the Cambridge Companion to British Poetry. Although we've just briefly interacted, I've already been very impressed with Professor McLane's kindness, her honesty, and her passion for the work that she does. So please join me in welcoming Professor McLane.
I want to thank Shannon for that lovely introduction, and also Patrick Madden for inviting me and shepherding me here, and Scott Morris. They've been wonderful welcomers, and also from the English department, Professor Matthew Wickman and Nick Mason. This is my first visit to Utah, and it has been such a wonderful visit and such a wonderful welcome. And I thought I would read today some poems from each of my 2 books, and then some newer things, which I hope will flow into a forthcoming book. And can you hear me all right? I'm working a little bit against a cold, so I apologize for that. My first book was called Same Life, and it got its title from a phrase that emerged in a poem in the book, and that phrase seemed to me to encompass some of the motifs and commitments of that book, which is interested in how our lives are both singular and shareable. And so I thought I'd read you a few poems first from that book, beginning with the last poem, An Envoy. And sometimes my work actively takes up predecessors, both formally and specific poets, Wordsworth, some ancient Greek poets, some Latin poets, and an envoy is typically a short poem or a turn that sends a work out into the world, an envoy. So this was the envoy to Same Life, sending forth that book. Go, little mine book, and blow her head off. Make her retch and weep and ache in the gut. Make her regret everything about her life that doesn't include me. Not all poems are friendly, but many of my poems are much more friendly. The opening poem of Same Life was called Were Fragments Enough? And you'll see in the course of the reading, I often find myself working with fragments, either fragments left to us by antiquity, or fragments of life as we experience our lives in parts. Were fragments enough? Were fragments enough for a life, for a fiction of continuity? In our every cell, a tiny alphabet restricts itself to the possible mutations. Evolution proceeding along lines imperceptible as the day I was thrown from the imaginary car and broke the barrier of this carrying life. It is true I take pleasure annihilating all the world to append thought caught in a fan's whirring blade. On this question of fragments, one set of fragments that I've been continually interested in and moved by are those left to us by the ancient Greek poet Sappho, lyric poet. And one of the sequences in that book is called After Sappho, and it takes up some of the fragments we have and uses them as launching pads for some poems after Sappho. After Sappho 1. Some say a host of horsemen, a horizon of ships under sail is most beautiful, but I say it is whatever you love. I say it is you. After Sappho 2. I would rather see your face than all. After Sappho 3. Neither the women of the city rising over the lake, nor those of the medieval towns shining on the rivered island, nor the beauties floating down these gridded, taxied streets, nor any man ever is pleasing to my eyes but you. After Sappho 4. It's true the charm may lie somewhat in the subject, such as gardens, wedding songs, love affairs. Against these few will speak, and all at one time may have hoped. But there is your bending neck and the small hollow at the base of your long back, and no charm other. Song likes its own delights, and even sadness in some modes charms those whose hearts have moved so. What to do with the soul, its many motions? After Sappho 5. And you, whom I will likely never see again, I hope it has all gone well, that the lover has finally left his wife, that roses now climb the trellis you'd staked and you've left the less than stellar job. Perhaps everything has changed. You deserved every gift you got and all the ones you never did. You led so many onward, and if when they arrived they found themselves alone, aflame, you above all know I was left so, my insides ash. Why blame the fire for its damage? For so long it gave a lovely light. And when I last saw you and you so lightly said, "Oh, wait there, love. Oh, wait a moment, love." How could that bird in my throat, though I had snuffed that all out, not revive? I often work in series or sequences, and the next poem I'm going to read you extracts from, it's, I remember I went to a reading by the Irish poet Paul Muldoon, and he said the four most terrifying words in the English language were a sequence of poems. And taking that under advisement, I will nevertheless offer you some extracts from sequences of poems, and hopefully they will not pummel you into boredom. But this poem is called From Ms. N, the Serial. And there are a couple of allusions en route that might be worth glossing. One is later in the poem, there's a quotation from Othello, and there's a mention of a very obscure Scottish antiquarian whom almost nobody knows, but I'm sure Professor Wickman knows, and probably Professor Mason, John Pinkerton. He crops up in a moment in the poem, and as do Wordsworth and Edmund Burke. So, and this is maybe also a nod to those of you who study Romanticism, as I do, and the way that I think most writers feel that, you know, you bring your whole self to your writing. And if you're into a certain kind of music, if you're into a certain kind of historical period, if you're into a certain kind of fashion, of course that is going to surface in your writing. And so it's no surprise that certain either romantic poets or motifs pop up in my writing. From Ms. N, the Serial. Like all children, Ms. N lived in archaic mythic zones, and all the neighbors and kin played their parts to a T, though they never were able to tell her the whole story. The child Ms. N sat on her bed and wondered. That tree outside her window shifted when her eyes shifted. What to make of that? Ms. N and her siblings had a dog for some time. They went on vacation, and when they came back, no dog. They asked the parents, "The dog?" who replied, "What dog?" And some people wonder why others distrust the obvious. Ms. N sometimes thinks what N stands for: nothing. One day she said nihilism in school, and the teacher paused, chalk between her fingers like her longed-for cigarette. "What's nihilism?" Another student said, "I thought it was nihilism." This was another example of Ms. N bringing up topics that went nowhere. The blackest black is not so black, it cannot take a blacker black. So Ms. N thinks the void would speak, if void could speak, or of color, think. Ms. N is writing what she hopes will be a masterpiece. Mispronunciation, the definitive autobiography. She only includes the bloopers she remembers. She is very strict like that. What's vagina? Hard G, she called to her parents, age 5, when they'd plopped her on the sofa with a picture book to help her learn where babies. Some years later, she told a story at dinner about being very angry with a persecuting teacher. "I spoke," she said, "with great vehemence." Her father laughed, a somewhat unkind laugh, and asked her to repeat it. She did, and once again, he laughed. Ms. N vehemently objects to the making fun of children who struggle every day to get their words and bodies aligned. Ms. N embarks one day upon a sonnet, attracted by the knowledge that it's dead, extinct, like dinosaur, dodo, or bonnet long replaced by baseball caps on heads that centuries ago were piled with curls, birds, powder, wires, and such machinery 'twould blow the minds of tattooed boys and girls who cruise the streets of this new century. Ms. N concedes she's antiquarian. Old hat, old news, a hoarder of ancient dirt, to quote the moldy Scot, John Pinkerton. But from her dead-end path, she won't divert. The airplane made the train a living fossil. Relic herself, she listens for its whistle. Wordsworth never took a plane, but Ms. N takes a plane with Wordsworth on her mind, and other matters: love, fear, a wish to die. Wordsworth had a very sturdy mind and legs that took him far into the mountains, Scottish glens, German towns, and yes, across the Alps. Ms. N has never seen the Alps, nor Snowdon, nor a mountain anywhere beyond the ancient Adirondacks. Wordsworth, too, she thinks would like their worn-down humps, their pathless woods, the rowboats by the shores of placid lakes ready for exploring. Young Wordsworth stole a rowboat, rode out on a lake one night, and found himself appalled. The mountain strode sublime after him, and he trembled, and his mind, as Burke had said it would before sublimity, near failed. There are passages in life, in Wordsworth, he called spots of time, and Ms. N has some spots she sometimes recollects. But now she's happy, incredulous, in love, and in strange anguish wants to recollect nothing. If it were now to die, 'twere now to be most happy, she murmurs with the engine nearly exploding with the fragility and perverse strength of all that lives and moves and has its being in the air, on the ground, in the sea. Having reached a floating state of grace, surprised by joy, she wants to die. Life can only get worse, the mountain receding below them as they climb. A shorter poem called "Terrible Things Are Happening." Terrible things are happening in Russian novels. Just yesterday, I heard in the cafe of two peasants, long friends, one in sudden possession of a watch hanging from a gold chain, which so disturbed his compadre, he stole upon the other unsuspecting, prayed to God, and slit his throat, fleeing with a watch. And that's not the worst of it. Just yesterday, my love and I too had not exactly a fight, but a reckoning, perhaps, or no, a conversation which opened the ocean of grief. And now she is in another city, perhaps crying, and not because of Russian novels. The book I most recently published is called World Enough, which some of you may know comes from a Marvell poem, To His Coy Mistress, a kind of seduction poem. If there be world enough in time, this coyness mistress were no crime, as the speaker is trying to get this woman into bed. Well, I was interested in world enough, not in that way, but in a way, ongoing thinking about what is world enough for me and for any of us. The phrase popped up organically, world enough, in a poem, and when I was thinking about titles for the book, I thought, well, this is the one that I thought pointed to some of the aspirations of the book, and it's a book very preoccupied with both inner and outer weather, how what's in the air circulates through our minds and hearts. And so the opening poem of that book is called Roundel, and that's also the name of a form, and a form that itself is quite obsessed with repetition and circulation, as the book itself is. Possibilities of change, possibilities of continuity. Roundel. The sea's in the dolphin, the sun's in the rose. The stars in my lungs are breathing. The clouds in the rain, the sea's in. Time to unlink every chain, linking doing to what's been done, to doing again and again. The sea's in the dolphin, the sun's in the rose, are the stars my lungs breathe in, the clouds in the rain, the sea's in. This book features 3 poems called Passage 1, 2, and 3, and they track certain passages through either landscapes or seasons. So I thought I'd read you from Passage 1. Little moth, I do not think you'll escape this night. I do not think you'll escape this night, little moth. Bees in clover, summer half over, friends without lovers. I bite a carrot, horsefly bites me. I thought it was you moving through the trees, but it was the trees. I thought it was your finger grazing my knee. It was the breeze. I thought prayers were rising to a God alive in my mind. They rose on the wind. I thought I had all the time and world enough to discover what I could when it was over. I thought I would always be young, though I knew the years passed, and knowing turned my hair gray. I thought it was a welcome, what I took for a sign, the sun, the unsymboling sun. Watch the clouds. On any given day, even they don't keep their shape for more than a minute. Sociable shifters bringing weather from elsewhere until we say now it's our weather here. Vermont shore lit by a fugitive sun who doesn't believe in a day's redemption. Sunset renovation at the expected hour, but the actual palette still a surprise. Little cat kneading my chest, milkless breasts, take your pleasure where you can. Not that I was alive, but that we were. As Shannon so nicely said in her introduction, this book in particular is very preoccupied with places and how one registers where one is or has been. And this is a poem called L.A., which I have only visited very briefly, once or twice, but I thought I am in a Western mode, so I thought I'd share with you L.A. Let me say first oleanders. Oleanders and cactus abounded as if commandeered to grace a set idea of the place. And the pastel stuccoed rows and London plains lining the sidewalked avenues as if anyone biked or walked and England existed. These are stereotypes, so let's sing them in stereo. I love LA, I love LA. And what is nature but the about to be transformed, or the never to be, or whatever is and is and is and lacks a finishing touch. The pools imply a plein air delinquency, the Hockney blue of this one, its kidney shape echoing my too, as I've been taught by beans and x-rays and forensic anatomists. A gaggle of kids kibitzing round a common table, the great American mashup visible at the poolside bar. The children of the Pacific, the Sikh black beturbaned and perhaps scimitarred, and other faces shining Spanish and Indogene announce a West so beautiful and confabulated the idea of the desert recedes. A poem called Haunt, which is itself haunted by a number of things, including ballads, which is a zone I have been working on, balladry and ballad collections, and I'm very interested in. And this is a poem, one might say, haunted by birdsong in general, and by the way, birdsong appears in old balladry. There's a ballad, some of you may know it, called The Three Ravens, and it's the Scottish version, the Twa Corbies. And it's interesting because in the English version, The Three Ravens, there are three birds who see a dead knight on a field, and they say, first they say, where are we going to go have breakfast? Where should we have breakfast? And one says, there's a dead knight on the field. And the other birds say, well, how terrible, but he's being guarded by his hawks and his hound, and there's his beloved. How fortunate that the knight has such loyal, the dead knight has such loyal mourners. Whereas in the Twa Corbies, you have the Scottish birds saying, where are we going to go and dine today? And they say, there's a dead knight. And they say, his hawks have abandoned him, his hounds have abandoned him, and his beloved has abandoned him. Let's kill him. Let's eat him. You know. So, and some people say this is diagnostic of the difference between the English and the Scots. But I think that's a libel on the Scots myself. But it also shows how the basic plot and situation template can go one way or can go another way. Right? It can either be an elegy, as it is in The Three Ravens, or it can be a kind of weird, mock, grotesque, hair-raising poem in the Twa Corbies. So these kinds of motifs have always been in my mind, and that's one of the things behind this poem, but also just the world we live in. Haunt. There are too many cedars here, hiding the sun, hovering over the dead the lakes won't wash away, and the ghosts the locals talk of are their memories, singing and shifting unbidden. I heard it last night. I saw it on the staircase. Testimony weaving its own shimmering cloth we wear to keep ourselves warm and to spare the others our nakedness. Better not to have heard the stories, the dead children, lunatic mothers, gimlet-eyed servants and absentee lairds the old murder ballads in Scotland depend on. There's a dead soldier on Old Failed Dyke on yonder green plain, a night centuries ago. There's a dead woman in the river, dead baby in the cradle. There's a dead soldier in the desert, and three crows wonder over and over whether to cry out an elegy or to sit on his breastbone and pike out his bonny blue eyen. From a, dare I say, a sequence of poems, and these, World Enough, among the places in which it stations itself, is France, and in Paris in particular, where I had spent some time in the past 5 years, and that was a wonderful opportunity and a very interesting way to be thinking again about America from that vantage. And also I was very interested in French forms, French poetic forms, and how, and also the French chanson, various French musical forms. And this particular poem takes up a form, the triolet, again, a form very interested in repeat, refrain, and repetition, which is also one of the obsessive motifs of this poem called Songs of a Season. So I'll just read you from it. Sun through the thick glass, another morning come. Dreams done, dawn past, sun through the thick glass, a faint light, the day's cast. What's done is done and done. Sun through the thick glass, another morning come. To want to be awake every hour, to miss nothing of the changeable air, the lake. To want to be awake in the light and starred dark, every instant another thing to want. To be awake every hour, to miss nothing. A tender mist barely there in the morning, a soft sun, dew on the grass, light chill in the air, a tender mist barely there. August near over. What to make clear before the end of the season? A tender mist, barely there in the morning, a soft sun. The husband I never think of returns one night in a dream. Who were those people? The moon above, the husband I never think of, shines its indifferent love, shines its unwavering beam. The husband I never think of returns one night in a dream. Sun in the cedars, the moon in the pines. The day breaks itself clear, sun in the cedars, of the moon in the pines, and everyone sees again how it ends, the sun in the cedars, the moon in the pines. Have I been resting my elbows in birdshit? Are those birds nesting above, flinging direct hits where I have been resting my arms? Was it a blue tit what done it? I have been resting my elbows in birdshit. Was it merely personal, this interest in one's own life? Each morning brought the same bird call. Was it merely personal, the persistent cardinal? He sang in the cedars, a red knife. Was it merely personal, this interest in one's own life? The grandparents sink below the horizon like their parents before. Unlinked to the earth, the grandparents sink. What they were, what we are, soon indistinct. The effort of living done, the grandparents sink below the horizon. Morning sun gone, clouds in the hemlock, the wash undone. Morning sun gone, what should I have done? Called the friend, taken a long walk. Morning sun gone, clouds in the hemlock. Good looks will only get you so far, and that far I fully intend to go. So she says, smoking in the car, good looks will only get you so far. Scanning for lines in the mirror, she considers what Botox won't mend. Good looks will get you only so far, whatever you fully intend. No escape from the endless chatter of people on cell phones, talking as if it all mattered. No escape from the chatter, the world to be nattered away in a blizzard of blank tones. No escape from the endless chatter of people, cell phones. Time to admit that misanthropy has a logic to it. Time to admit some days you'd quit the species and flee. Time to admit that misanthropy. What happens in one place will soon happen everywhere, wrote the man with the seamed face. What happens in one place will not be confined to that place, will spread and soon displace what happens. One place will soon become everywhere. Do you still think of me as I still think of you when I'm by the sea? Do you still think of me when you pass that stand of cherry trees, that bar on 81st only we knew? Do you still think of me as I still think of you? Never again to visit that place and never to think of it. Never to see again that face, never to visit that place, never to try to stash the suitcase in an overhead bin it won't fit. Never again to visit that place and never to think of it. Who were you to her and who was she to me? At 3 a.m., I wonder. Who were you to her and what did you murmur to her when you suddenly saw me? Who you were to her? And who she was to me? Those little crushes that sneak up, tiny ambushes. These little crushes betrayed by flushes you can't cover up. Those little crushes, they sneak up. 5 weathers in one afternoon. A day seemed a year, seemed a life, seemed a cloud become a balloon, 5 weathers in one afternoon. However it changes, the moon rings its changes, each riff less brief than the weather this afternoon. A day seemed a year, seemed a life. And I thought I would read a couple of things that are not in this book, but are either hot off the presses or in my hard drive, and share them with you. I envision this next book tentatively. It has a few possible titles: one Embroidered Earth, one Dark Wood, one Bright Path. So there's a lot humming around. But a poem, Another Day in This Here Cosmos. Storm threat, cloud-darkened mountain, computer unplugged. Commuters to nature on a plain of grass, the sheep munch clear of clover. A park's a way to keep what's gone enclosed forever. Rhyme is cheap, so is pop. Easy to be obese in a land fat with rape. Now the sun burns unprotected skin, now the sheep dream of lanolin. To everything alive, we're kin. Eat or be eaten, what the vegan spurns and the Jane. I saved a fly, I baptized William Blake and released to the sky. Of course he'll die. The new grasses, a brighter green than the older spears, make this a scene of summer starring black butterflies. The fairy queen alights from her magic car, a red convertible, and she a glam tranny. The sheep don't care. The sheep don't mind. In 3 months the wind will blow these trees bare, but for the tall pines littering the forest floor with browning needles gone soft in the slow trample of small creatures and long rain. A park's a way to keep what's gone enclosed forever. And a poem, Western, which seemed appropriate to read here, especially, perhaps, Western. I can see the big sky people have a point. The clouds mounting high above the lake give the lie to the fat claims of mountains. The eye requires a horizon, Thoreau somewhere said. Somewhere over yesterday's rainbow, the clouds compact of mysteries rise and billow, ample sheets in the blue. The line is an orienting thing. The horizon, the plumb line, the halyard we tightened for good sailing. How we want the world rigged tight, yet not rigged against us. In Texas, Montana, Dakota, they know it. The cattle rounded up for decades into a genre near dead as the passenger pigeons that famously darkened the sky. And a final poem that takes up some Wallace Stevens-y-ness. Summer beer with endangered glacier. My one eye does not match the other. Corrective lenses regulate whatever needs require. Seeing, I was being seen. Let be finale. Let our virtues tally up against the obvious. If we don't believe ourselves custodial, why all the hoobla-hoo, the hullabaloo? Passivist, mon semblable, ma sœur, soi-même, blow through this blue. Thank you very much. Yes.
How long, on average, does it take you to write a poem?
That's a great question. How long on average does it take me to write a poem? And I could say everything from 5 minutes to 15 years because I could point to poems, and in part because I toggle between some very short forms and some long forms. Some things are more additive and they take place growing over time and with a lot of revision. And sometimes things are very, very swift distillations, like that poem Envoy. It just came to me in a flash. But it also is the case that some poems that look apparently short and very immediate, they might have taken years to go over. So I'm slightly fudging an answer to your question, but it is to say I'm a person who doesn't have a reliable routine about that. In my first book included poems that had been written 12 years previously and really up to the minute. And it's a thing that is interesting to learn over time what your own hibernating and incubating rhythms are. And it's also the case that some poems are you may have been implicitly writing them your whole life, and that they manifest themselves on a certain day or in a certain month.
Do you find that you prefer that people find their own interpretation of your poem, or do you hope that they'll find what you intended?
Again, another great question. Do I find that I prefer people find their own interpretations of my poems, or do I wish that they would align with my interpretations of them? And I have to say I'm very agnostic about that, because I feel first very grateful for any and all readers. I mean, I also feel very passionately, and I hope you'll know how to hear this. It's a very perverse thing to say. Part of me doesn't care if any of you ever read poetry, right? You shouldn't read poetry because you have to, except in class, then you must, right? But I mean, as a person in the world, it's not about taking your vitamins, and I always hate those defenses of poetry, that are, the Republic is failing because nobody is literate anymore and nobody's reading. And I feel like that's a conversation about something else. It's not really a conversation about poetry. It's a conversation about our worries about, our country. And what I feel is that, as William Carlos Williams says, if it ain't a pleasure, it ain't a poem. And some people may find my poems pleasurable and interesting, and some people might just despise them. And I feel like it is a free country. So given that, on the other hand, of course I hope that, I think any strong writing, of course, guides your reading, right? It sets up a feedback loop, and it sets up motifs, and if it's strong enough, probably you're not going to beam down on a completely alien planet than what I thought. But I also feel like, I'm all for, reading is a free act, and interpreting is a free act, and it's not for me to go around legislating. So that's my answer to that question. That's not how I teach, by the way. I'm actually much more doctrinaire. I said, no, Shelley could not possibly have meant that, and here's why, right? There were not refrigerators in 18, so there, there are certain things that are actually wrong, I do, but you're asking me a question about, we're both alive in the same moment, how do you respond freely to a text, as opposed to, how do I think, what is a more plausible reckoning with Plato? What is a more plausible reckoning with Wordsworth? A very different question. So, yes?
When did you begin writing poetry?
The question, when did I begin writing poetry? It's again, a really excellent question, because I'm sure I was scribbling some very tragic, horrible things in adolescence, and also just throwing them away, thank God. And it's interesting. I wonder if I have this with me. I have a response to that question, which is actually the opening of this book that I'm going to publish. It's a kind of experimental hybrid criticism memoir. And I'll just read you a little bit of the proem in the form of a Q&A. How long have you written poetry? Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Emily Dickinson. Why do you read poetry? I caught this morning's minion. Hopkins. Why do you read poetry? Batter my heart. John Donne. Why do you read poetry? I have wasted my life. James Wright. Etc., etc. What is the first poem you remember? She sailed away one sunny summer day on the back of a crocodile. Little tunes. And then to the specific question, why poetry? Where there's personal liking we go. Marianne Moore. Why poetry? Poetry is connate with the origin of man. Shelley. Why poetry? Of all things of thought, poetry is closest to thought. Hannah Arendt. Why poetry? The immortal mind craves objects that endure. Wordsworth. Why poetry? The poem is sad because it wants to be yours and cannot. Ashbery. Why poetry? We lived quietly among the stars, knowing money isn't what matters. Harriet Mullen. Why poetry? A need for poetry. John Cage. Why do you write poetry? I am a native in this world and think in it as a native thinks. Wallace Stevens. Why do you write poetry? Because existence is thrust willy-nilly into our hands. Our fate is to make something. If nothing else, the shape cut by the arc of our lives. Frank Bedard. Why do you write poetry? Odi et amo. Catullus. Why do you write poetry? My purpose here is to advance into the sense of the weather. Lisa Robertson. Why do you write poetry? I sing to use the waiting. Emily Dickinson. So, as you see, I mean, this is a book that's very invested in showing how, at least the contents of my brain are completely saturated with other poets and writers and thinkers. And I think the contents of all of our brains are saturated with the texts that are close to us, whether it's, the Bible or the Quran or poets or punk rock. I mean, our brains are live growing appropriative things, and my brain gravitated to language arts, and it's filled with that. So the question of when I started writing poetry, it's probably close to when I started reading poetry. Reading and writing being in a very close relation for me. Yes.
Trying to think of how to word this question. You're very interested in the question of place and in exploring place, but none of your, well, not none, but in many of the poems that we heard today, you don't spend a lot of time emphasizing setting. And I thought that was really interesting, and wonder what your, I don't want to say definition, but what do you see as the meaning of placeness?
That's a great comment, that my poems seem to be really interested in place, and yet they don't much emphasize setting, per se. Is that an accurate paraphrase? And I think that's a very accurate description of the poems you heard. And there are some others, for example, in the toward the end of World Enough, that are more clearly stationed in settings in the Adirondacks in upstate New York and on Lake Champlain, where the mountains of Vermont matter. Lake Champlain as a lake matters, and the histories of places deeply matter. And one of the things I'm very interested in are the strata of histories in a place. So in upstate New York, there are the Algonquin and Mohawks lived there, and then you get the Dutch and the English and the French battling over. And those layers show up in a number of my poems in terms of the histories of peoples moving through places and how they've left their mark in names or in various erasures. And that's a thing I'm fascinated by, especially in this country as a totality, and I'm sure you all know this very well out here. But to the more precise question about how place matters, I actually have a phobia about description. I kind of despise description in poetry. I feel there's this now, and I can immediately think of these other examples that I actually love. But as a general principle, I tend to feel Ezra Pound has a wonderful line, and not that one should always quote Ezra Pound, but he has a interesting line about, he says, this is 100 years ago, and he says, don't be viewy. If a thing can be done better in prose, let it be done in prose. And so sometimes I feel that there's a lot of like creaking of the gear shifts in poems that are, and now I'm going to describe X and Y and Z. I sort of feel description for me becomes a very clotted thing, and what I'm more interested in is about sensory registration, how we internalize. And one of the ways we do is we breathe, right? So whatever the air is around us, it is entering our cells and we are exhaling into it. Such literal things as exhalation and inspiration are the ways we internalize place. So I think I tend to write from the position of inner experience activated by places, rather than let me scan externally. Here's the street plan, or here is the trail. It's more you are on the trail and what's happening on the trail.